Stories are the only currency I need, Marcus interrupted, already turning to adjust his ancient boombox. And you, Professor Mitchell, are full of untold ones. Drink, the market is waiting. Dave retreated to his spot against the wall, cup warming his hands. The coffee's scent grew stronger, more complex. He took a sip and felt warmth spread from his center, chasing away more than just the December cold. The market's sound seemed to shift, deepening, taking on harmonies he hadn't noticed before. He blinked, and for a moment thought he saw something impossible. Ships that couldn't exist anchored at the harbor's edge, their sails made of shadow and starlight. He blinked again, and the vision remained. Marcus's voice drifted over, though when Dave looked, the vendor seemed occupied with other customers. "Welcome to the night harbor, Professor. Mind your step. The boundaries between worlds are thin here, and some stories have teeth." Dave's first step toward the harbor felt different, as if the cobblestones beneath his feet had softened. The air thickened with possibility, heavy with the scent of foreign spices and distant seas. Marcus's coffee warmed his hands, each sip making the ships at the water's edge more distinct, more real. The regular fishing boats were still there, but between them, Dave blinked hard, his academic mind struggling to catalog what he saw. A Viking longship, its dragon-head prow breathing actual steam into the winter air. Next to it, a Chinese junk with sails that rippled like silk in a wind that didn't exist. Further along, a Greek trireme floated high atop the water, its bronze ram gleaming with otherworldly light. The dock itself had changed. The familiar concrete and steel had given way to ancient wooden planks that seemed to absorb the sound of his footsteps. The planks extended far beyond where the real harbor should end, disappearing into a fog that glowed with its own inner light. Lanterns floated at irregular intervals, their flames burning in mystical colors. As he walked closer to the ships, he noticed the people, if they could all be called that. A tall woman in Viking furs argued with what appeared to be a Japanese kappa, water constantly rippling in the bowl-shaped hollow of its green-scaled head. A group of what had to be selkies huddled near the water's edge, their magical seal skins draped over human shoulders like precious cloaks. A man with goat legs, a faun from the old stories, hurried past carrying a stack of books that whispered to each other. "First time in the night harbor?" The voice came from his left, where a small stall had appeared between one breath and the next. The vendor was an elderly Chinese woman who might have been 60 or 600. Everyone remembers their first time, the way the world opens up, yes, like waking from a dream into a better dream. Dave found himself drawn to her stall. Bottles of every size and shape lined the shelves, each containing what looked like swirling clouds of color. "What are they?" he heard himself ask. "Stories, of course. Some lost, some forgotten, some not yet told." She lifted one bottle where crimson and gold clouds twisted around each other. "This one? A love story from the Tang Dynasty. Never written down, but too beautiful to die. That one there," she pointed to a bottle of midnight blue, "is the last dream of a whale who sang alone for 20 years. And this," she held up a clear bottle that seemed empty until it caught the light. "This is your story, Professor. The one you're afraid to tell." Dave stepped back, nearly spilling his coffee. "How did you—" "The same way Marcus knew. We all know a story seeker when we see one." She smiled, revealing teeth that might have been pearl or moonlight. "But you're not ready for these yet. The night harbor reveals what you need when you need it. Best to explore a bit first. Yes? Find your sea legs." She gestured toward the longest dock, where the strangest ships were moored. "Follow the lanterns. They'll show you where you need to go. But mind the gaps between the planks. The water here runs deep, and some of what swims below remembers older, hungrier times. Dave looked down at the dark water between the dock's planks. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in the depths, something vast and ancient stirring. He clutched his coffee cup tighter and started walking toward the ships, careful to step where the floating lanterns cast their otherworldly light. The first ship Dave approached was the Viking longship. Its dragon-head prow turned to watch him pass, eyes gleaming with actual flame. On its deck, a woman with silver-white hair and crow-feather cloak arranged runes that skittered across her table like nervous mice. "Seeking stories, are you?" Her voice carried the chill of Norse winters. "We have sagas here that would crack your modern skull open, tales of gods and giants that haven't been heard since the old tongues died." She held up a runestone that hummed with blue light. "But perhaps you're not ready for such weighty tales." Dave moved on, drawn to the Chinese junk where paper lanterns floated without strings. An elderly man in elaborate robe sat cross-legged on a silk cushion that hovered above the deck. Before him, scrolls unrolled themselves in midair, characters swimming across the paper like schools of fish. "Ah, a teacher who can no longer teach," the man said without opening his eyes. "A storyteller who has lost his stories. We have many such visitors." He gestured, and a scroll floated closer to Dave. "These are tales that escaped the burning of the Imperial Library, stories that survived by hiding in dreams and whispers." The scroll's characters rearranged themselves into English before Dave's eyes, but as he reached for it, the old man raised a warning hand. "These words bite, Professor. Are you sure your fingers can handle their teeth?" Each ship seemed to house its own strange and magical marketplace. On the Greek trireme, 3 women shared a single eye between them, passing it back and forth as they wove tapestries from thread of starlight. The patterns showed stories unfolding, heroes and monsters, triumphs and tragedies, all shifting and changing as he watched. "You could be in this one," the sister with the eye said, her fingers never stopping their work. "Every story needs new blood sometimes." "Fresh perspectives," added the second sister, reaching for the eye. "New endings," concluded the third, her blind face turned toward Dave with unsettling accuracy. The deeper into the harbor he walked, the stranger the vessels became. A Spanish galleon made entirely of books, its sails pages of forbidden texts. A Polynesian outrigger that seemed to float on moonlight rather than water. Its navigator, a woman with tattoos that moved across her skin like living things. Between the ships, smaller vendors had set up stalls on floating platforms. A young girl sold bottles of distilled déjà vu. A man with fox eyes offered memories of places that never existed. A creature that seemed made entirely of shadows traded in slightly used happy endings. Dave's coffee had long since gone cold, but he couldn't bring himself to let go of the cup. It felt like his only anchor to the real world, though even that certainty was beginning to fade. How long had he been walking? The fog made time feel slippery, unreliable. The next ship struck him silent, a massive Arabian dhow, its wooden sides carved with stories that moved and changed as he watched. On its deck, a man sat surrounded by thousands of floating lights, each one containing what looked like a miniature scene. "These are the stories that got away," he said, gesturing to the lights, "the ones that slipped through cracks in reality or died halfway through telling or got lost in translation." He caught one of the lights and held it out. Inside, Dave saw a familiar scene, himself standing at a lecture podium. But this version wasn't falling apart. This version was finishing the lecture, the students leaning forward, engaged and inspired. "What might have been," the man said softly, "but that's not what you're really looking for, is it?" Dave shook his head, though he wasn't sure why. The light floated back to join its companions. No, I thought not. You're looking for something more fundamental. He stood, his robe shimmering with embedded stories. Come aboard, Professor Mitchell. I believe I have what you seek. The gangplank adjusted its angle as Dave approached, almost eager. Each step onto the ship's deck felt like walking into a library, a temple, and a dream all at once. The wood beneath his feet was warm, alive with the pulse of countless narratives. The man led him to the stern, where a circular space had been arranged with cushions that seemed woven from twilight. Above them, the stars were wrong, constellations he'd never seen telling stories he couldn't quite grasp. Your grandmother, the man said, settling onto one of the cushions. She understood about stories, about their weight, their hunger. That's why she sent you here. She didn't send me. Dave started to protest, but stopped. Had there been something in that last letter, some hint in her stories about Hamburg that he'd missed? Not directly, no. The man's smile was kind but knowing. But she knew what lived in these waters, what waited for those who've lost their way. He reached into the air and plucked another light, this one pulsing with a familiar warmth. Look. Inside the sphere, Dave saw his grandmother's study, saw himself at 7, curled in her oversized armchair while she told stories of ships and sailors, of harbors where magic still lived if you knew where to look. He watched his younger self lean forward, eyes wide, drinking in every word. You didn't lose your stories, Professor Mitchell. You buried them, wrapped them in academic papers and theoretical frameworks until they couldn't breathe. His voice was gentle but firm. Stories aren't meant to be dissected. They're meant to be fed. Fed? Stories are living things. They hunger, they grow, they change. He gestured at the lights around them. These aren't just tales. They're possibilities. Each one a path not taken, a word not spoken, a dream not quite remembered upon waking. He stood moving to a small cabinet inlaid with mother of pearl that shifted like oil on water. I can give you back what you've lost, help you remember how to feed your stories, how to let them breathe. He opened the cabinet, removing something that glowed like a coal in his hands. But there's a price. There always is in stories like this, Dave said, his academic knowledge surfacing. The pearl of great price, the forbidden fruit, the devil's bargain. Good, you haven't forgotten everything. He opened his hands. In his palms lay what looked like an old fountain pen, its barrel made of dark wood that seemed to absorb light. This belonged to your grandmother. Dave stared at it. That's impossible. Her pen was buried with her. Was it? The man's smile deepened. Or was that just another story? The pen called to him. His fingers itched to hold it, to feel its weight. What's the price? You'll have to give up analyzing stories. No more papers on narrative structure. No more lectures on comparative mythology. His eyes held Dave's. You'll have to become part of the stories instead. Let them use you as much as you use them. That's my whole career, my life's work. No, your life's work was sharing stories, making them live. Remember? He held out the pen. You can have this life back, the tenure, the publications, the academic respect, or you can have the stories themselves, not to study, to live, to breathe, to feed. Dave stared at the pen, remembering his grandmother's voice. Stories are like cats, they go where they please. He understood now. She hadn't been talking about stories moving through trade routes or cultural transmission. She'd been talking about something more fundamental, more alive. If I take it, he asked, his voice barely a whisper, then you join us. Become part of the Night Harbor's story, a keeper of tales rather than a scholar of them. He gestured at the floating lights around them. These stories need tending, feeding, sharing. They need someone who remembers how to make them dance. Dave thought about his empty flat, the blank documents, the unwritten papers, thought about his students' faces when he used to bring old tales to life, before he started dissecting them instead. Thought about his grandmother's study, warm with stories and possibility. And if I don't? Then you wake up by the fish market convinced this was all a dream born of